My dad let my brother ruin my life just to teach me a lesson. My name is Maya, and in my family, responsibility isn't a trait. It's a role you're assigned and never allowed to quit. My father, Robert Hayes, runs our household the way he runs his company, with color-coded calendars, performance reviews disguised as family talks, and an unwavering belief that emotions are inefficiencies. He likes charts, measurable outcomes, and rules that apply to everyone. At least that's what he says. In reality, they only ever seem to apply to me. My older brother, Luke, is the exception to every rule. If I was the project, he was the brand. Where I was promising, he was special. From the outside, we probably look like your standard overachieving family. Successful father, quiet mother, golden son, dutiful daughter. On the inside, it was a hierarchy so clear you could have drawn it on one of Dad's spreadsheets. Growing up, the double standards weren't subtle. When I brought home straight A's, Dad would nod and say, as expected, "Good, stay consistent, Maya." That was it. No hug, no pride, just a verbal checkmark in a box only he could see. When Luke dragged in with a report card full of C's and the occasional Mercy B, Dad clapped him on the back like he'd just won the state championship. "C, improvement. I knew you had it in you," he'd beam, as if mediocrity were a sign of hidden genius. The first time I asked why my best was expected, and his bare minimum was amazing, Dad didn't hesitate. "Because you're different," he said. "You're reliable. You don't need applause for doing what's right. Don't be ungrateful." Ungrateful. That word became the shut-off valve to every question I dared to form. Any attempt to point out unfairness was repackaged as a character flaw, a sign that I didn't appreciate the opportunity of being held to a higher standard. So I learned the safest path was silence. Perform, obey, excel, and never complain. In our house, obedience was survival. Speaking up was rebellion. Luke floated through the chaos he created, shielded by Dad's indulgent pride, while I stood in the background, the steady one, the responsible one, quietly collecting every slight and swallowing every protest until they settled like stones at the bottom of my ribs. By the time Luke and I were in high school, his role in the family had upgraded from favored child to untouchable myth. He was the natural leader, according to Dad, even though he couldn't lead himself out of bed before noon on weekends. He was misunderstood, creative, still finding his path, all while I was on track, predictable, and low maintenance. I'd never realized those could sound like insults until I heard how softly Dad spoke about Luke in comparison. Luke crashed Dad's car when he was 17. He took it without asking, sped down the highway to impress his friends, and spun out on a turn he'd misjudged. The car hit a guardrail. Miraculously, no one was hurt, just shaken and laughing, high on adrenaline they didn't deserve. Dad was furious for exactly 12 hours. I listened from the top of the stairs that night as he paced the living room, voice raised, demanding to know what Luke had been thinking. Luke muttered apologies, threw in a few tears, blamed peer pressure and a stupid mistake. By morning, the mood had shifted. "We all screw up," Dad said, handing Luke a mug of coffee like a peace offering. "You'll learn from this. It'll make you stronger." When I backed out of the driveway for my driving test a few months later, Dad stood beside the car with a stony expression. "Do not scratch it, Maya. I mean it. We can't afford recklessness from you. Recklessness from me, as if that was ever an option." Luke partied on weeknights, rolled in reeking of beer and cheap cologne, and slept through first period like it was a constitutional right. Teachers called home. Detentions stacked up. Each time, Dad smoothed things over with a phone call, a meeting, or a donation. Then he'd come home, eyes tired but weirdly proud. "He's passionate," he'd tell my mother. "He just needs direction. Once he finds his purpose, he'll outshine us all." If I tried to step in, tried to tell Luke he couldn't keep doing this, that he was going to throw away everything, Dad shut me down fast. "Don't act like his mother," he'd snap. "That's not your job." So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I turned my anger into fuel. I studied harder. I became top of my class. I loaded my schedule with AP courses, extracurriculars, volunteer hours. I built myself into the kind of daughter any normal parent would have bragged about. But the more I achieved, the more Dad folded my success into a story about Luke. "See, Luke," he'd say, pointing at my GPA or an award plaque. "Your sister is setting an example. One day you'll be inspired by her and surpass us all." Inspired, as if my effort existed only as a motivational poster for him. We settled into a toxic triangle. Dad enabling, Luke exploiting, me absorbing. I was the cushion for every consequence Luke never faced, the invisible scaffolding propping up a son who had never been asked to stand on his own. And every time Dad looked at him with that determined hope, the kind he never turned on me, I felt another quiet fracture open inside my chest. Senior year felt like the light at the end of a very long, very narrow tunnel. I had a plan: graduate at the top of my class, get into a good university, and use my summer internship at Dad's company as a launch pad out of the house and into my own life. Landing that internship had felt for a moment like a win that was actually mine. The selection process had been competitive: applications, essays, interviews with managers who didn't know me as Robert's daughter, but as a candidate with a portfolio, ideas, and a work ethic. When the acceptance email arrived, it addressed me as Ms. Hayes, not Maya, the responsible one. I read it 10 times. At dinner that night, Mom smiled softly when I shared the news. "We're proud of you," she said, almost under her breath. Dad nodded briskly. "Of course they chose you. Don't let it get to your head. This is just the beginning." Still, there was a glint in his eye that felt close to approval. I held on to it like a fragile trophy. Then Luke found out. He'd been drifting through community college with no declared major, treating classes like optional social events. The idea that I had something he didn't, especially in Dad's world, was intolerable. "Wait," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're interning at the firm this summer." "Yes," I replied, "in the strategy and operations department." He shot a look at Dad. "I've been saying I want to get more serious about business. Why don't I get to do that?" Dad's jaw tightened. Guilt, frustration, pride all mashed together. It was a look I knew too well. "It's a selective program," I said carefully. "You have to apply. Luke can shadow you," Dad cut in. "It'll be informal, an opportunity to observe how things work. It'll be good for both of you." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. "What? Dad, this is my internship. It's structured. I have a supervisor, projects. A real leader adapts," he said. "Consider it a test of your ability to manage distractions and still perform. You want to be taken seriously in business. This is part of it." I swallowed the protest rising in my throat. Mom stayed silent, fingers tightening around her water glass. So Luke became my uninvited shadow. From day one, he treated the office like a social club. While I focused on onboarding documents and data sets, he strolled from desk to desk, charming my coworkers, cracking jokes, dropping Dad's name like a VIP pass. "Relax, Maya," he'd whisper, draping himself over the empty chair at my workstation. "You're so tense. People like you don't have to be a robot." He used my login when I stepped away, clicking into folders he had no clearance to access. I caught him once scrolling through confidential project files. "You can't be in there," I hissed, yanking the mouse from his hand. "This is secure data." He rolled his eyes. "Chill, I'm just looking. It's not like I'm stealing anything." I went to Dad that evening, bracing for support. "Luke's being careless," I said. "He's in systems without authorization. This could get me in trouble." Dad smirked, as if I'd just validated some private theory. "Maybe this will teach you patience. You need to learn to work with difficult people. That's leadership." He wasn't just ignoring the problem, he was enjoying it. My frustration, my helplessness, had become part of some twisted case study in his mind. That's when something inside me shifted. This wasn't about Luke's growth or my development. It was about Dad's experiment, and I was the lab rat who knew exactly what was happening and still couldn't get out. The day everything imploded started like any other. Too early, too cold, and too quiet. I arrived at the office 15 minutes before my start time, as usual. Luke strolled in 20 minutes late, iced coffee in hand, as usual. My supervisor, Jenna, gave him a tight smile and gave me a tight nod, and the day slipped into its normal, uneasy rhythm. We were in the middle of a high-stakes project, one of those confidential, internal initiatives Dad loved to brag about in vague terms. My job was mostly data cleaning and compiling reports, but still, my login had access to information stamped with red internal use only warnings. Luke had been circling that project for days, asking questions that made my skin crawl. "So this client," he'd say, leaning over my shoulder, "they're a big deal, right? Like game changer level." "I can't talk about it," I'd reply, "and neither can you." He'd just laugh. "You're such a rule book." The breach happened on a Wednesday. Around noon, Jenna called me into a conference room. Her expression was unreadable, calm, but not kind. "Close the door, Maya," she said. My stomach dropped. I sat down opposite her. She slid her tablet across the table, the company logo glowing at the top of an open email thread. "Can you explain this?" she asked. On the screen was an email chain between our company and a major prospective client, a client associated with the very project I'd been assisting on. Attached were internal documents, preliminary strategy outlines, early data models, projected outcomes. All files I recognized. All files sent from my company email address. The timestamp was from late last night. "I didn't send this," I said immediately. My voice sounded thin in the glass-walled room. "I wasn't even here that late. I left at 6. The system shows your account logged in remotely at 11:42 p.m., she replied. From an IP address matching your home network. I stared at the screen. My mind moved too fast and not fast enough. Someone used my login, I said. It has to be a mistake or a breach. The security team has checked, she said, still level, still distant. No signs of external hacking. The client forwarded this to us concerned about the ethics of sharing confidential internal drafts. They were under the impression you sent it directly to them to prove initiative. My throat tightened. That's not true. She held my gaze for a long moment, then sighed. Given the situation, we have to take this seriously. Effective immediately, you're suspended pending a full investigation. You'll need to turn in your badge and company devices before you leave today. It felt surreal, like watching a movie where the protagonist was about to be ruined and powerless to stop it. I didn't do this, I said again. I would never risk. We'll sort out what happened, she said, but her tone said she'd already filed me under liability. For now, I need you to cooperate. I walked back to my desk in a daze. Luke wasn't there. His chair was empty, his things scattered like he'd just stepped out for a break. I turned in my badge, shut down my laptop, and rode the elevator to the lobby, vision blurring around the edges. Outside, the summer air felt too bright, too loud. On the bus ride home, my phone buzzed with messages from coworkers. Hey, are you okay? What happened? HR is asking questions. Shame pressed against my ribs like a physical weight. But under the panic, a thought surfaced, clear and cold. Luke. At home, I called Dad. It rang twice before he answered. Maya, I'm in a meeting, make it quick. My voice cracked on the first word. Dad, I've been suspended. Someone used my login to send confidential files to a client. They think it was me. He was silent for a beat too long. I didn't do it, I rushed on. You know I wouldn't. I think it was Luke. He was using my login. You've seen him do it. He exhaled slowly, like this was all deeply inconvenient. Maya, panicking won't help. I'm not panicking. I'm telling you the truth. You can talk to HR. You can tell them Luke had access. I already did, he said. I froze. You already talked to them. Yes. They asked if I was aware of any misconduct. I told them no. No, the words scraped out of me. But you know Maya, he cut in, voice cool, managerial. Sometimes losing everything is the best lesson. The world seemed to tilt. What? I whispered. You've grown up in a relatively controlled environment, he said, like he was giving a lecture. You assume effort guarantees reward, that the world recognizes your intentions. It doesn't. This will teach you something important about accountability and resilience. You're letting them blame me for something I didn't do, I said, disbelief giving way to a rising, unfamiliar fury. You know I'm innocent. In business, he replied, perception is reality. If your account was used, then you're responsible. That's how the world works. Better you learn that now. I stood in the middle of my room, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the sound of my father justifying my professional execution, as if he were assigning a quarterly objective. You could clear my name, I said, voice shaking. One call, one email, you could say what actually happened. I won't interfere, he said. You need this. One day you'll thank me. He hung up before I could respond. I stared at my reflection in the dark phone screen, heat flooding my face, then draining away. Betrayal felt less like a stab and more like a slow unhooking, a realization that the one person who could pull me out of the fire had chosen to hold me in it instead. Luke had used me, but my father had abandoned me, and that hurt more than anything. The suspension became termination within a week. The official letter arrived in a thin white envelope, addressed to Ms. Maya Hayes. The formality felt cruelly ironic. The company that had once called me a promising asset now informed me, in careful legal language, that my breach of corporate ethics rendered me unfit for continued employment. I read it sitting on the edge of my bed, the afternoon light turning the paper almost translucent. Each sentence was a verdict. Each clause a reminder that in the eyes of a place I dreamed about working, I was not just disposable, but dishonorable. I folded the letter back into the envelope and set it on my desk, as if distance might make it less real. The days blurred. I stayed in my room, curtains half drawn, laptop closed. My phone lit up with messages I couldn't bear to open. Friends checking in, classmates asking about the internship, coworkers trying to gossip without sounding like they were trying to gossip. I ignored them all. Mom would knock sometimes. Maya, dinner's ready. I'm not hungry, I'd say. A pause, a sigh, soft footsteps receding down the hall. She never pressed, never came in, never sat beside me and asked the obvious question. What happened? Whether it was fear of Dad, loyalty, or a lifetime of learned silence, I didn't know. All I knew was that the one parent who might have been my ally was a muted outline, moving carefully around the edges of my pain. Luke avoided me altogether. I heard him in the house, laughing on calls, clattering in the kitchen, the front door door opening and closing, but he never knocked on my door. He never asked if I was okay. He never apologized. At night, sleep came in fitful bursts. I'd wake up with my pulse racing, replaying every decision, every moment where I could have changed the outcome. Why hadn't I guarded my login more carefully? Why hadn't I reported him sooner? Why had I trusted that Dad would protect me? My mind circled the same dark truth. If I could do everything right and still end up branded the villain, what had all that effort been for? One afternoon, I took the termination letter out again and laid it flat on my desk. This time, I read it slowly, deliberately. I let the words land. Unauthorized disclosure of confidential materials. Breach of trust. Inconsistent with the company's core values. The pain was still there, but something else had grown alongside it. Something sharper, steadier. Anger. But for the first time, it wasn't aimed inward. It wasn't the familiar self-disgust whispering that I should have been better, smarter, quieter. It was directed outward, toward the two people who had orchestrated this disaster and walked away untouched. Luke, who'd used my identity like a costume. Dad, who'd let me burn to prove a point. They had taken my reputation, my opportunity, and weeks of my life. They had expected me to fold under the weight of shame and come crawling back, more obedient, more grateful. Instead, as I stared at the letter, a different thought formed. You think this is a lesson. Fine, I'll learn it, but not the way you intended. The chance to act came from the same place Luke's worst decisions always did. Carelessness. A few days after the termination, I left my room for the first time long enough to grab a glass of water. The house was quiet. Mom was at the grocery store. Dad still at work. Luke's door at the end of the hall was open a crack. His laptop sat on his desk, screen glowing, unattended, unlocked. I should have walked past. I almost did. Then I thought about the termination letter, about Dad's voice on the phone, about the way everyone at the office had looked at me as I turned in my badge. I stepped into his room. The laptop screen showed a chat window, Luke's name at the top, messages from friends piling up. No password prompt, no screensaver. He hadn't even bothered. I hesitated for one last second, then sat down and started scrolling. The chat logs were worse than I expected. Dude, one friend had written, timestamped 2 days before my suspension. That's savage. Luke, she had it coming. Miss Perfect needed to be knocked off her pedestal. Friend, what if she gets fired or something? Luke, law, then she'll finally chill. Dad will fix it anyway. Message after message documented the leak in grotesque detail. He'd bragged about using my login, about sending the files to impress the client's junior rep he'd been flirting with. He called it a win-win. He'd look resourceful, and if anything went wrong, I'd bounce back like always. I took photos of everything with my phone, every timestamp, every boast. Then I dug deeper. Email, social media. A folder on his desktop labeled stuff, about as subtle as he'd ever been. Inside were screenshots, drafts of the leaked documents, the client's contact info, copied from my files, each one another link in a chain he didn't even realize he'd forged. And then I found the messages with Dad. Not on the laptop, on Luke's linked phone account, synced to his desktop. A casual convenience that for once worked against him. Dad, HR reached out. I denied any knowledge of misconduct. Luke and Maya. Dad, she'll recover. This will be good for her in the long run. She's been coasting on being the responsible one. Needs a humbling experience. Humbling experience. My vision tunneled. It wasn't just that he'd refused to help me. He'd actively chosen to let me fall, then framed it as character development. I screenshotted every message, forwarded them to a new encrypted email account I just created, and backed them up twice. By the time I logged out, my hands had stopped shaking. This wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was evidence. I left Luke's room quietly, closing the door to the same narrow gap he'd left it. In the hallway mirror, my reflection looked different, less like a girl who'd been cornered, more like someone who'd finally seen the full layout of the trap. They wanted to teach me about the real world. Fine, the real world had rules too. Legal ones, ethical ones, consequences. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to build a case. I invited them all to dinner the following Friday. I want to clear the air, I told Mom in the kitchen that morning. I'm tired of everyone tiptoeing around this. She studied my face, searching for cracks. Are you sure, Maya? Yes, I said. I'm done hiding in my room. I cooked. It gave my hands something to do while my mind replayed the plan. I roasted chicken, sautéed vegetables, even baked the rolls Dad liked. The ones he once half-joked were, "The only thing about you that isn't overachieving." I placed my phone on a sideboard just off the dining room, recording app open, microphone unobstructed. Old habits from true crime podcasts and privacy warnings flickered through my head. I'd already confirmed that recording in our state without consent was risky but not necessarily illegal if used carefully. Either way, I wasn't relying on this for a courtroom. This was for clarity. For them. For me. At 7, we all sat down. Dad at the head of the table, as always. Mom to his right. Luke across from me, scrolling his phone until Dad cleared his throat. "So," Dad said, carving into the chicken, "I assume this is about your situation." "My termination," I said. "Yes, it is." He glanced at Mom, then back at me. "If this is going to be emotional, let's keep it productive." "Don't worry," I replied. "I've prepared." Luke smirked. "Of course you have." I looked at him first. "Luke, did you send any emails from my company account to the Halden client?" His eyes flickered. "What? No, why would I?" I slid my phone out from beside my plate and tapped the screen. The dining room filled with the sound of his voice, tinny but unmistakable. She had it coming. Miss Perfect needed to be knocked off her pedestal. Silence. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. The recording continued. "Dude, that's like career ending." "Nah, Dad will fix it anyway." Luke went pale. "Where did you get that?" he demanded, voice rising. "You went through my stuff." "Yes," I said calmly. "The same way you went through mine." I turned to Dad. "And you," I said. "Did HR ask if you knew about any misconduct related to my account?" His face tightened. "This is not the time or place." On cue, another recording played from my phone. This time, text-to-speech reading Dad's messages. HR reached out. I denied any knowledge of misconduct. "She'll recover. This will be good for her in the long run. She's been coasting on being the responsible one. Needs a humbling experience." Mom's hand flew to her mouth. The color drained from her face. "Robert," she whispered. You said that." Dad stood abruptly, napkin falling to the floor. "This is taken out of context." "There is no context," I said, standing too. My voice was steady in a way it had never been with him. "You knew I was innocent. You knew Luke used my login. You chose to let me take the fall because you wanted to prove a point. I wanted to teach you about the real world," he snapped. The polished executive veneer cracked, revealing something harder, uglier. "Actions have consequences. You think being good protects you. It doesn't. You needed to toughen up." "Toughen up," Mom repeated, incredulous. "By sacrificing her job, her reputation." He rounded on her. "You of all people know what the world is like. I'm preparing her." "No," I said. "You're not. You're just cruel." He turned back to me, eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone." I laughed once incredulously. "Or what? You'll ruin my life again." "Newsflash, you already did. The difference is now I know it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice." Luke finally found his voice. "Look, it wasn't that serious. I didn't think." "That's the problem," I cut in. "You didn't think. You never do, because you've never had to live with the consequences of your actions." Dad made sure of that. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Dad like he always did when he needed saving. But Dad wasn't looking at him. He was looking at me, fury and something like fear battling in his gaze. "You went through private devices, private conversations," he said. "Do you realize what you've done? This is a breach of privacy. It's vindictive. It proves my point. You're not as righteous as you think." "I'm not righteous," I said. "I'm tired. Tired of being the one who gets up early, works hard, follows the rules, and somehow ends up punished so you can feel like a wise mentor." I stepped closer to the table, hands flat on the wood. "You wanted me to learn about accountability. Fine. Here it is. Luke leaked confidential data from my account. You lied to HR and let them destroy my career. You called it a humbling experience. That's your accountability, Dad. Own it." Mom's voice, when it came, was low but shaking with anger I'd never heard from her before. "How could you?" she said to Dad. "She's our daughter, not some employee you can manipulate. You watched her fall apart and did nothing, less than nothing." He stared at her, startled, as if she'd broken an unspoken contract. "I did what I thought was best," he insisted. "You're being dramatic." "Best for who?" she shot back. "For Luke, for your image, certainly not for her." Luke pushed his chair back, knocking it over. "This is insane. You're all overreacting. Maya, you're not actually going to what? Ruin my life over a mistake. You ruined mine," I said quietly. "Consider this balance." The room seethed with overlapping voices, Dad defending, Mom accusing, Luke pleading. But for once, I wasn't scrambling to keep the peace. I let the chaos rise around me, untouched. Dad finally grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "This conversation is over," he said. "Turn off that recording. We will discuss this when everyone has calmed down." "No," I said. "We won't." He froze, half turned toward the door. "I'm done," I continued. "Done playing the good daughter. Done swallowing everything so you can feel like a mastermind. You don't get to decide what happens next." His jaw clenched. For the first time in my life, I saw it. He no longer had full control. He left without another word, the front door slamming behind him. Luke followed a few minutes later, muttering curses, slamming his own door upstairs. The house fell quiet. Mom and I stood in the wreckage of the evening. Half-eaten food, spilled water, an overturned chair. She looked at me, eyes wet. Maya, I'm so sorry. I exhaled, a long, trembling breath. I know, I said. Me too. But under the exhaustion, something new had settled in my chest. A lightness. Not happiness, not yet. Just the absence of fear. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of my father. The board heard about the leak 2 weeks later. I made sure of it. I didn't send the evidence from my personal email or my name. I compiled a neat, anonymous packet. Screenshots of Luke's chats, copies of the files he'd sent, timestamps matching my suspension, and the messages from Dad bragging. Because that's what it was, about letting me take the hit for a humbling experience. I attached a short note, submitted in the interest of protecting the company's integrity and ensuring ethical leadership at the highest levels. The board of directors did what boards do when confronted with potential scandal. They investigated, quietly, thoroughly, and with an eye toward liability. I heard about the fallout in pieces, through a friend of a friend still at the company, then through news trickling back to my father in the form of tense phone calls and late-night arguments. Luke's access to the building, which had been unofficial to begin with, was explicitly revoked. An internal memo labeled his actions a serious ethics violation. His name was added, unofficially but effectively, to a list of people never to be hired, referred, or recommended. He's been blacklisted, my friend texted me. Not just here, words getting around. Dad didn't lose his job, not immediately. Senior executives rarely do. But the board restructured his responsibilities. They launched an internal review of his handling of the incident. He was removed from the mentorship program he'd once proudly overseen. Rumors spread. Words like poor judgment, nepotism, and conflict of interest floated through the corridors he used to stride down with unshakable confidence. At home, the atmosphere curdled. Dad spent more time in his office, door closed. Mom moved quietly, carefully, as if sound itself might trigger another explosion. Luke oscillated between rage and self-pity, ranting about how one mistake had ruined everything, never acknowledging that my one mistake hadn't even been mine. I packed. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed suitcases or declarations. Just a slow, deliberate folding of clothing, boxing of books, gathering of the fragments of a life I'd outgrown. I found a place, I told Mom one evening. A small apartment near downtown. I signed the lease today. She stared at me, eyes wide and glossy. You didn't tell us you were looking. You wouldn't have wanted me to, I said gently. But I can't stay here, Mom, not after all this. She nodded, lips pressed tight to hold back tears. Do you have enough money? I'll manage, I said. I'd been saving for years. College funds, scholarship stipends, part-time tutoring. Independence had always been the goal. It just came sooner and harsher than I'd planned. When I carried the last box to my car, Dad stood in the doorway, arms crossed. So you're running away, he said. I'm leaving, I replied. There's a difference. You think you're better than us now, he asked. Because you aired our dirty laundry, because you won. I met his gaze steadily. There's no winning here. I lost my internship. You lost your credibility. Luke lost his future in your industry. This isn't a victory, it's consequences. He scoffed. You'll come back. The world out there is harsher than anything I've ever done to you. Maybe, I said. But at least out there, the rules are written down. And if someone stabs you in the back, they don't call it love. I drove away with my car full and my heart hollow. The apartment was small, one bedroom, thin walls, second-hand furniture that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. It was quiet, lonely. And yet, that first night, lying on a mattress on the floor, I felt something I'd never felt in my parents' house. Free. The cost was high. A fractured family, a father's permanent disappointment, a brother's resentment. But my integrity, my sense of self, was intact. For once, I hadn't just survived the fallout. I had chosen it. He showed up on a Sunday. No call, no text. Just a knock on my apartment door, sharp and insistent. I opened it to find my father standing in the hallway, suit slightly rumpled, eyes tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Maya, he said, we need to talk. I stepped aside without inviting him in. Old habits die hard. He looked around the small space. The mismatched furniture, the second-hand bookshelf, the stack of dishes drying by the sink. If he was judging, he kept it to himself. You've settled in, he said. I have. An awkward silence stretched between us. For once, he seemed unsure how to start. I've been thinking, he said finally, about everything that happened, about my methods. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Your methods, he nodded. I may have been overly rigid, harsh, but you have to understand I was trying to prepare you. My own father never. This isn't about your father, I said quietly. It's about you. He closed his mouth, then opened it again. My approach was unconventional, yes, but life is unforgiving. I wanted you to be strong enough to handle that, to not expect fairness, to not crumble at the first sign of injustice. You didn't prepare me for injustice, I said. You enacted it. There's a difference. He flinched just slightly. You could have taught me resilience without destroying my reputation, I continued. You could have talked to me, mentored me, supported me. Instead, you let me be falsely accused and called it growth. That wasn't discipline. It was cruelty dressed up as wisdom. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. I'm your father, he said. Everything I did for your own good. No, I said, and the word felt like a door clicking shut. You did it for your own ego, to prove you were right about the world, to prove that your way, the hard way, the painful way, was the only way. He opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time, I watched my words land and stay, undeflected by rationalizations or condescension. He had nothing left to lean on, not authority, not certainty, not my fear. You're angry, he said finally. I'm not just angry, I replied. I'm done letting you define what's good for me. We stood there, the silence heavier than any lecture he'd ever given. I hope, he said slowly, that one day you'll understand why I understand perfectly, I interrupted. That's the problem. He looked at me for a long moment, eyes searching for the obedient daughter he'd always known. She wasn't there. Without another word, he turned and left. The door closed softly behind him. No slam, no final dramatic gesture. Just an ending. A few days later, Luke texted, "Hey, I'm sorry. I screwed up. Can we talk?" I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I set the phone down, unanswered. Not out of pettiness, but out of clarity. Some conversations could happen later. Some might never happen at all. Either way, I no longer needed their apologies to validate my reality. Now, I work at a different firm. It's not as big as my father's company, not as prestigious on paper. The office is smaller, the coffee is worse, and no one wears suits unless investors are visiting. On my first day, my new manager looked me in the eye and said, "If you make a mistake, tell us. We'll fix it together." I believed her. We have clear ethics policies, not just as documents buried in onboarding packets, but as principles we talk about in meetings. When a junior analyst accidentally sent a draft report to the wrong client last month, no one sacrificed her to prove a point. We addressed it, apologized, and tightened our processes. Accountability, I've learned, doesn't have to be punitive. It can be collaborative. It can be fair. When people ask about my previous internship, I give them a version of the truth that fits into polite conversation. It ended abruptly. There were some internal issues. If they press, I decide, case by case, how much to share. Not because I'm ashamed anymore, but because I've reclaimed the story. It belongs to me now. Outside of work, I volunteer at a mentorship program for young women, high school and college students who are trying to navigate family pressure, academic expectations, and the crushing weight of being the responsible one. I listen to them talk about parents who dismiss their feelings, siblings who coast on charm, teachers who expect perfection without support. I don't give them speeches. I ask questions. What do you want? What feels unfair? What would it look like to stand up for yourself, even a little? Sometimes I tell them about a girl who lost an internship she didn't deserve to lose, who was betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect her. I watch their faces as they recognize pieces of themselves in the story. Did she forgive them? One girl asked me recently. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Forgiveness is complicated, but she stopped believing that their treatment of her defined her worth. That was the important part. In quiet moments, usually late at night with a cup of tea cooling on my desk, I think about my family, about Dad, pacing in some smaller office now, adjusting to a version of his life where his judgment is no longer beyond question. About Luke, trying to find a path that isn't paved with second chances and someone else's reputation. I don't wish them harm. I don't wish them well either exactly. I wish them clarity, accountability, the kind they denied me until I forced it into existence. People say family is supposed to teach you who you are. Sometimes, though, it teaches you who you refuse to become. I'm not the obedient daughter anymore. I'm not the scapegoat or the silent achiever or the cautionary tale. I am someone who walked through betrayal and came out the other side with my integrity intact, even if I had to burn some bridges to get there. When I think about my father's favorite phrase, life lessons, I almost laugh. He did teach me a lesson, in the end. just not the one he intended. He taught me that love without respect is just control. That fairness matters, even when the world insists it doesn't. That my voice, once I decided to use it, was more powerful than his silence. And most of all, he taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step out of the role you were assigned and write your own script, no permission required.